Okay. All right. Well then, welcome, welcome, welcome. Hello everyone. We are ready for another night of The Mysterious Island by Jules Verne. Um, it's been a... Oh, is my audio playing nice? Hang on. I think we're okay. Yep, we're fine. Okay. Sorry about that. Had to go into the office today, so it is a long, long day. But we are ready to go, and we are settled in. I've got my coffee, I've got my book, and we are comfy. So, with that, let's just go ahead and dive right in. Chapter 14. The next day, the 16th of April, and Easter Sunday, the settlers issued from the chimneys at daybreak and proceeded to wash their linen. The engineer intended to manufacture soap as soon as he could procure the necessary materials: soda or potash, fat or oil. The important question of renewing their wardrobe would be treated of in the proper time and place. At any rate, their clothes would last at least 6 months longer, for they were strong and could resist the wear of manual labor. But all would depend on the situation of the island with regard to inhabited land. This would be settled today, if the weather permitted. The sun, rising above a clear horizon, announced a magnificent day, one of those beautiful autumn days which are like the last farewells of the warm season. It was now necessary to complete the observations of the evening before, by measuring the height of the cliff above the level of the sea. "Shall you not need an instrument similar to the one which you used yesterday?" asked Herbert to the engineer. "No, my boy," replied the latter. "We are going to proceed differently, but in as precise a way." Herbert, wishing to learn everything he could, followed the engineer to the beach. Pencroft, Neb, and the reporter remained behind and occupied themselves in different ways. Cyrus Harding had provided himself with a straight stick, 12 feet long, which he had measured as exactly as possible by comparing it with his own height, which he knew to a hair. Herbert carried a plumb line which Harding had given him, that is to say, a simple stone fastened to the end of a flexible fiber. Having reached a spot about 20 feet from the edge of the beach, and nearly 500 feet from the cliff, which rose perpendicularly, Harding thrust the pole 2 feet into the sand, and wedging it up carefully, he managed, by means of the plumb line, to erect it perpendicularly with the plane of the horizon. That done, he retired the necessary distance, when, lying on the sand, his eye glanced at the same time at the top of the pole and the crest of the cliff. He carefully marked the place with a little stick. Then, addressing Herbert, "Do you know the first principles of geometry?" he asked. "Slightly, Captain," replied Herbert, who did not wish to put himself forward. "You remember—" Just a moment. Sorry, cat is being a bit of a problem, so I'll be just a moment. Sorry about that. She is not very thrilled that I've been away all day, but it is what it is. She'll settle in eventually, I'm sure. Anyway, returning to the book. Then addressing Herbert, "Do you know the first principles of geometry?" he asked. "Slightly, Captain," replied Herbert, who did not wish to put himself forward. "You remember what are the properties of two similar triangles?" "Yes," replied Herbert. "Their homologous sides are proportional." "Well, my boy, I have just constructed two similar right-angled triangles. The first, the smallest, has for its sides the perpendicular pole, the distance which separates the little stick from the foot of the pole, and my visual ray for hypotenuse. The second has for its sides the perpendicular cliff, the height of which we wish to measure, the distance which separates the little stick from the bottom of the cliff, and my visual ray also forms its hypotenuse, which proves to be a prolongation of that of the first triangle." "Ah, Captain, I understand," cried Herbert. "As the distance from the stick to the pole is the distance from the stick to the base of the cliff, so is the height of the pole to the height of the cliff." "Just so, Herbert," replied the engineer, and when we have measured the two first distances, knowing the height of the pole, we shall only have a sum in proportion to do, which will give us the height of the cliff, and will save us the trouble of measuring it directly. The two horizontal distances were found out by means of the pole, whose length above the sand was exactly 10 feet. The first distance was 15 feet between the stick and the place where the pole was thrust into the sand. The second distance between the stick and the bottom of the cliff was 500 feet. These measurements finished, Cyrus Harding and the lad returned to the Chimneys. The engineer then took a flat stone, which he had brought back from one of his previous excursions, a sort of slate, on which it was easy to trace figures with a sharp shell. He then proved the following proportions. 15 by 500 is to 10 to x. 500 times 10 is 5,000. 5,000 divided by 15 is 333.3, from which it was proved that the granite cliff measured 333 feet in height. Cyrus Harding then took the instrument, which he had made the evening before, the space between its two legs giving the angular distance between the star Alpha and the horizon. He measured, very exactly, the opening of this angle on a circumference, which he divided into 360 equal parts. Now, this angle, by adding to it the 27 degrees which separated Alpha from the Antarctic pole, and by reducing to the level of the sea the height of the cliff on which the observation had been made, was found to be 53 degrees. These 53 degrees, being subtracted from 90 degrees, the distance from the pole to the equator, there remained 37 degrees. Cyrus Harding concluded, therefore, that Lincoln Island was situated on the 37th degree of the southern latitude, or, taking into consideration through the imperfection of the performance, an error of 5 degrees, that it must be situated between the 35th and the 40th parallel. There was only the longitude to be obtained, and the position of the island would be determined. The engineer hoped to attempt this the same day, at 12 o'clock, at which moment the sun would pass the meridian. It was decided that Sunday should be spent in a walk, or rather, an exploring expedition, to that side of the island between the north of the lake and Shark Gulf, and if there was time, they would push their discoveries to the eastern side of Cape South Mandible. They would breakfast on the downs, and not return till evening. At 8:30, the little band was following the edge of the channel, on the other side of Safety Islet. Numerous birds were gravely strutting. They were divers, easily recognized by their cry, which much resembles the braying of a donkey. Pencroft only considered them in an eatable point of view, and learnt with some satisfaction that their flesh, though blackish, is not bad food. Great amphibious creatures could also be seen crawling on the sand, seals, doubtless, who appeared to have chosen the islet for a place of refuge. It was impossible to think of those animals in an alimentary point of view, for their oily flesh is detestable. However, Cyrus Harding observed them attentively, and without making known his idea, he announced to his companions that very soon they would pay a visit to the islet. The beach was strewn with innumerable shells, some of which would have rejoiced the heart of a conchologist. There were, among others, the Phasianella, the Terebratule, etc. But what would be of more use was the discovery, by Neb, at low tide, of a large oyster bed among the rocks, nearly 5 miles from the Chimneys. Neb will not have lost his day, cried Pencroft, looking at the spacious oyster bed. It is really a fortunate discovery, said the reporter, and it is said that each oyster produces yearly from 50 to 60,000 eggs. We shall have an inexhaustible supply there. Only I believe that the oyster is not very nourishing, said Herbert. No, replied Barnett. The oyster contains very little nitrogen, and if a man lived exclusively on them, he would have to eat not less than 15 to 16 dozen a day. Capital, replied Pencroft. We might swallow dozens and dozens without exhausting the bed. Shall we take some for breakfast? And without waiting for a reply to this proposal, knowing that it would be approved of, the sailor and Neb detached a quantity of the mollusks. They put them in a sort of net of hibiscus fiber, which Neb had manufactured, and which already contained food. They then continued to climb the coast between the downs and the sea. From time to time, Harding consulted his watch, so as to be prepared in time for the solar observation, which had to be made exactly at midday. All that part of the island was very barren, and as far to the point which closed Union Bay, and which had received the name of Cape South Mandeville. Nothing could be seen there but sand and shells, mingled with debris of lava. A few seabirds frequented this desolate coast. Gulls, great albatrosses, as well as wild duck, for which Pencroft had a great fancy. He tried to knock some over with an arrow, but without result, for they seldom perched, and he could not hit them on the wing. This led the sailor to repeat to the engineer, "You see, Captain, so long as we have not one or two fowling pieces, we shall never get anything." "Doubtless, Pencroft," replied the reporter, "but it depends on you. Procure us some iron for the barrels, steel for the hammers, saltpeter, coal, and sulphur for powder, mercury and nitric acid for the fulminate, and lead for the shot, and the captain will make us first-rate guns." "Oh," replied the engineer, "we might, no doubt, find all these substances on the island, but a gun is a delicate instrument, and needs very particular tools. However, we shall see later." "Why," replied Pencroft, "were we obliged to throw overboard all the weapons we had with us in the car, all our instruments, even our pocket knives?" "But if we had not thrown them away, Pencroft, the balloon would have thrown us to the bottom of the sea," said Herbert. "What you say is true, my boy," replied the sailor. Then, passing to another idea, "Think," said he, "how astounded Jonathan Forster and his companions must have been, when, next morning, they found the place empty, and the machine flown away." "I am utterly indifferent about knowing what they may have thought," said the reporter. "It was all my idea, that," said Pencroft with a satisfied air. "A splendid idea, Pencroft," replied Gideon Spilett, laughing, "and which has placed us where we are." "I would rather be here than in the hands of the Southerners," cried the sailor, "especially since the captain has been kind enough to come and join us again." "So would I, truly," replied the reporter. "Besides, what do we want? Nothing." "If that is not everything," replied Pencroft, laughing and shrugging his shoulders. "But some day or other we shall find the means of going away." "Sooner, perhaps, than you imagine, my friends," remarked the engineer. "If Lincoln Island is but a medium distance from an inhabited island, or from a continent, we shall know in an hour. I have not a map of the Pacific, but my memory has preserved a very clear recollection of its southern part. The latitude, which I obtained yesterday, placed New Zealand to the west of Lincoln Island, and the coast of Chile to the east. But between these two countries there is a distance of at least 6,000 miles. It has, therefore, to be determined what point in this great space the island occupies, and this the longitude will give us presently, with a sufficient approximation, I hope." "Is not the archipelago of the Pomotus the nearest point to us in latitude?" asked Herbert. "Yes," replied the engineer, "but the distance which separates us from it is more than 1,200 miles." "And that way?" asked Neb, who followed the conversation with extreme interest, pointing to the south. "That way nothing," replied Pencroft. "Nothing indeed," added the engineer. "Well, Cyrus," asked the reporter, "if Lincoln Island is not more than 2,000 or 3,000 miles from New Zealand or Chile—" "Well," replied the engineer, "instead of building a house, we will build a boat, and Master Pencroft shall be put in command." "Well then," cried the sailor, "I am quite ready to be captain, as soon as you can make a craft that's able to keep at sea." "We shall do it, if it is necessary," replied Cyrus Harding. But while these men, who really hesitated at nothing, were talking, the hour approached, at which the observation was to be made. What Cyrus Harding was to do to ascertain the passage of the sun at the meridian of the island, without an instrument of any sort, Herbert could not guess. The observers were then about 6 miles from the Chimneys, not far from the part of the downs in which the engineer had been found after his enigmatical preservation. They halted at this place, and prepared for breakfast, for it was 11:30. Herbert went for some fresh water from the stream which ran near, and brought it back in a jug, which Neb had provided. During these preparations, Harding arranged everything for his astronomical observation. He chose a clear place on the shore, which the ebbing tide had left perfectly level. This bed of fine sand was as smooth as ice, not a grain out of place. It was of little importance whether it was horizontal or not. and it did not matter much whether the stick 6 feet high, which was planted here, rose perpendicularly. On the contrary, the engineer inclined it towards the south, that is to say, in the direction of the coast opposite to the sun. For it must not be forgotten that the settlers in Lincoln Island, as the island was situated in the southern hemisphere, saw the radiant planet describe its diurnal arc above the northern and not the southern horizon. Herbert now understood how the engineer was going to proceed to ascertain the culmination of the sun, that is to say, its passing the meridian of the island, or, in other words, determine due south. It was by means of the shadow cast on the sand by the stick, a way which, for want of an instrument, would give him a suitable approach to the result which he wished to obtain. In fact, the moment when this shadow would reach its maximum of length would be exactly 12 o'clock, and it would be enough to watch the extremity of the shadow, so as to ascertain the instant when, after having successively diminished, it began to lengthen. By inclining his stick to the side opposite to the sun, Cyrus Harding made the shadow longer, and consequently its modifications would be more easily ascertained. In fact, the longer the needle of a dial is, the more easily can the movement of its point be followed. The shadow of the stick was nothing but the needle of a dial. The moment had come, and Cyrus Harding knelt on the sand, and with little wooden pegs, which he stuck into the sand, he began to mark the successive diminutions of the stick's shadow. His companions, bending over him, watched the operation with extreme interest. The reporter held his chronometer in his hand, ready to tell the hour which it marked when the shadow would be at its shortest. Moreover, as Cyrus Harding was working on the 16th of April, the day on which the true and the average time are identical, the hour given by Gideon Spilett would be the true hour then at Washington, which would simplify the calculation. Meanwhile, as the sun slowly advanced, the shadow slowly diminished, and when it appeared to Cyrus Harding that it was beginning to increase, he asked, "What o'clock is it?" 1 minute past 5, replied Gideon Spilett directly. They had now only to calculate the operation. Nothing could be easier. It could be said that there existed, in round numbers, a difference of 5 hours between the meridian of Washington and that of Lincoln Island. That is to say, it was midday in Lincoln Island when it was already 5 o'clock in the evening in Washington. Now, the sun, in its apparent movement round the earth, traverses 1 degree in 4 minutes, or 15 degrees an hour. 15 degrees multiplied by 5 hours give 75 degrees. Then, since Washington is 77 degrees 3 feet 11 seconds, or 3 minutes 11 seconds, as much as to say 77 degrees counted from the meridian of Greenwich, which the Americans take for their starting point for longitudes concurrently with the English, it followed that the island must be situated 77 and 75 degrees west of the meridian of Greenwich, that is to say, on the 152nd degree of west longitude. Cyrus Harding announced this result to his companions, and taking into consideration errors of observation, as he had done for the latitude, he believed he could positively affirm that the position of Lincoln Island was between the 35th and 37th parallel, between the 150th and the 155th meridian to the west of the meridian of Greenwich. The possible fault which he attributed to errors in the observation was, as it may be seen, of 5 degrees on both sides, which, at 60 miles to a degree, would give an error of 300 miles in latitude and longitude for the exact position. But this error would not influence the determination which it was necessary to take. It was very evident that Lincoln Island was at such a distance from every country or island that it would be too hazardous to attempt to reach one in a frail boat. In fact, this calculation placed it at least 1,200 miles from Tahiti and the islands of the archipelago of Pomotus, more than 1,800 miles from New Zealand, and more than 4,500 miles from the American coast. And when Cyrus Harding consulted his memory, he could not remember in any way that such an island occupied, in that part of the Pacific, the situation assigned to Lincoln Island. That is the end of chapter 14, wherein there was a lot of math, quite a lot of math, and they found that they were well and goodly in the middle of nowhere. And now, Chapter 15. The next day, the 17th of April, the sailor's first words were addressed to Gideon Spilett. "Well, sir, what shall we do today?" "What the captain pleases," replied the reporter. Till then, the engineer's companions had been brickmakers and potters. Now they were to become metallurgists. The day before, after breakfast, they had explored as far as the point of Mandible Cape, 7 miles distant from the Chimneys. There, the long series of downs ended, and the soil had a volcanic appearance. There were no longer high cliffs as at Prospect Heights, but a strange and capricious border which surrounded the narrow gulf between the two capes, formed of mineral matter, thrown up by the volcano. Arrived at this point, the settlers retraced their steps, and at nightfall entered the Chimneys. But they did not sleep before the question of knowing whether they could think of leaving Lincoln Island or not was definitely settled. The 1,200 miles which separated the island from the Paumotu Islands was a considerable distance. A boat could not cross it, especially at the approach of the bad season. Pencroft had expressly declared this. Now, to construct a simple boat, even with the necessary tools, was a difficult work, and the colonists not having tools, they must begin by making hammers, axes, adzes, saws, augers, planes, etc., which would take some time. It was decided, therefore, that they would winter at Lincoln Island, and that they would look for a more comfortable dwelling than the Chimneys, in which to pass the winter months. Before anything else could be done, it was necessary to make the iron ore, of which the engineer had observed some traces in the northwest part of the island, fit for use by converting it into iron or into steel. Metals are not generally found in the ground in a pure state. For the most part, they are combined with oxygen or sulfur. Such was the case with the 2 specimens which Cyrus Harding had brought back. One of magnetic iron, not carbonated, the other a pyrite, also called the sulphuret of iron. It was therefore the first, the oxide of iron, which they must reduce with coal. That is to say, get rid of the oxygen, to obtain it in a pure state. This reduction is made by subjecting the ore with coal to a high temperature, either by the rapid and easy Catalan method, which has the advantage of transforming the ore into iron in a single operation, or by the blast furnace, which first smelts the ore, then changes it into iron by carrying away the 3 to 4% of coal, which is combined with it. Now, Cyrus Harding wanted iron, and he wished to obtain it as soon as possible. The ore which he had picked up was in itself very pure and rich. It was the oxidulous iron, which is found in confused masses of a deep gray color. It gives a black dust, crystallized in the form of the regular octahedron. Native lodestones consist of this. Or, an iron of the first quality is made in Europe from that with which Sweden and Norway are so abundantly supplied. Not far from this vein was the vein of coal already made use of by the settlers. The ingredients for the manufacture being close together would greatly facilitate the treatment of the ore. This is the cause of the wealth of the mines in Great Britain, where the coal aids the manufacture of the metal extracted from the same soil at the same time as itself. "Then, Captain," said Pencroft, "we are going to work iron ore?" "Yes, my friend," replied the engineer, "and for that, something which will please you, we must begin by having a seal hunt on the islet." "A seal hunt!" cried the sailor, turning toward Gideon Spilett. "Are seals needed to make iron?" "Since Cyrus had said so," replied the reporter. But the engineer had already left the Chimneys, and Pencroft prepared for the seal hunt, without having received any other explanation. Cyrus Harding, Herbert, Gideon Spilett, Neb, and the sailor were soon collected on the shore, at a place where the channel left a ford passable at low tide. The hunters, therefore, could traverse it without getting wet higher than the knee. Harding then put his foot on the island for the first, and his companions for the second time. On their landing, some hundreds of penguins looked fearlessly at them. The hunters, armed with sticks, could have killed them easily, but they were not guilty of such useless massacre, as it was important not to frighten the seals, who were lying in the sand several cable lengths off. They also respected certain innocent-looking birds, whose wings were reduced to the state of stumps, spread out like fins, ornamented with feathers of a scaly appearance. The settlers, therefore, prudently advanced towards the north point, walking over ground riddled with little holes, which formed nests for the seabirds. Towards the extremity of the islet appeared great black heads floating just above the water, having exactly the appearance of rocks in motion. These were the seals which were to be captured. It was necessary, however, first to allow them to land, for with their close, short hair and their fusiform conformation, being excellent swimmers, it is difficult to catch them in the sea, while on land their short, webbed feet prevent their having more than a slow, waddling movement. Pencroft knew the habits of these creatures, and he advised waiting till they were stretched on the sand, when the sun, before long, would send them to sleep. They must then manage to cut off their retreat and knock them on the head. The hunters, having concealed themselves behind the rocks, waited silently. An hour passed before the seals came to play on the sand. They could count half a dozen. Pencroft and Herbert then went round the point of the islet, so as to take them in the rear, and cut off their retreat. During this time, Cyrus Harding, Spilett, and Neb, crawling behind the rocks, glided towards the future scene of combat. All at once, the tall figure of the sailor appeared. Pencroft shouted. The engineer and his two companions drew themselves between the sea and the seals. Two of the animals soon lay dead on the sand, but the rest regained the sea in safety. Here are the seals required, Captain, said the sailor, advancing toward the engineer. Capital, replied Harding. We will make bellows of them. Bellows! Cried Pencroft. Well, these are lucky seals! It was, in fact, a blowing machine, necessary for the treatment of the ore that the engineer wished to manufacture with the skins of the amphibious creatures. They were of a medium size, for their length did not exceed 6 feet. They resembled a dog about the head. As it was useless to burden themselves with the weight of both the animals, Neb and Pencroft resolved to skin them on the spot, while Cyrus Harding and the reporter continued to explore the islet. The sailor and the negro cleverly performed the operation, and 3 hours afterwards, Cyrus Harding had at his disposal 2 seal skins, which he intended to use in this state, without subjecting them to any tanning process. The settlers waited till the tide was low again, and crossing the channel, they entered the Chimneys. The skins had then to be stretched on a frame of wood and sewn by means of fibers, so as to preserve the air without allowing too much to escape. Cyrus Harding had nothing but the 2 steel blades from Top's collar, and yet he was so clever, and his companions aided him with so much intelligence, that 3 days afterwards the little colony's stock of tools was augmented by a blowing machine, destined to inject the air into the midst of the ore when it should be subjected to heat, an indispensable condition to the success of the operation. On the morning of the 20th of April began the metallic period, as the reporter called it in his notes. The engineer had decided, as it has been said, to operate near the veins both of coal and ore. Now, according to his observations, these veins were situated at the foot of the northeast spurs of Mount Franklin, that is to say, a distance of 6 miles from their home. It was impossible, therefore, to return every day to the Chimneys, and it was agreed that the little colony should camp under a hut of branches, so that the important operation could be followed night and day. This settled, they set out in the morning. Neb and Pencroft dragged the bellows on a hurdle, also a quantity of vegetables and animals, which they besides could renew on their way. The road led through Jacamar Wood, which they traversed obliquely from southeast to northwest, and in the thickest part, it was necessary to beat a path which would in the future form the most direct road to Prospect Heights and Mount Franklin. The trees, belonging to the species already discovered, were magnificent. Herbert found some new ones, among others some which Pencroft called shamleeks, for, in spite of their size, they were of the same liliaceous family as the onion, chive, shallot, or asparagus. These trees produce ligneous roots, which, when cooked, are excellent. From them, by fermentation, a very agreeable liquor is made. They therefore made a good store of the roots. The journey through the wood was long. It lasted the whole day, and so allowed plenty of time for examining the flora and fauna. Top, who took special charge of the fauna, ran through the grass and brushwood, putting up all sorts of game. Herbert and Gideon Spilett killed 2 kangaroos with bows and arrows, and also an animal which strongly resembled both a hedgehog and an anteater. It was like the first because it rolled itself into a ball and bristled with spines. The second because it had sharp claws, a long slender snout which terminated in a bird's beak, and an extendable tongue covered with little thorns which served to hold the insects. "And when it is in the pot," asked Pencroft naturally, "what will it be like?" "An excellent piece of beef," replied Herbert. "We will not ask more from it," replied the sailor. During this excursion they saw several wild boars, which, however, did not offer to attack the little band, and it appeared as if they would not meet with any dangerous beasts, when, in a thick part of the wood, the reporter thought he saw some paces from him, among the lower branches of a tree, an animal which he took for a bear, and which he very tranquilly began to draw. Happily for Gideon Spilett, the animal in question did not belong to the redoubtable family of the plantigrades. It was only a koala, better known under the name of the sloth, being about the size of a large dog, and having stiff hair of a dirty color, the paws armed with strong claws, which enabled it to climb trees and feed on the leaves. Having identified the animal, which they did not disturb, Gideon Spilett erased bear from the title of his sketch, putting koala in its place, and the journey was resumed. At 5 o'clock in the evening, Cyrus Harding gave the signal to halt. They were now outside the forest, at the beginning of the powerful spurs which supported Mount Franklin towards the west. At a distance of some 100 feet flowed the Red Creek, and consequently plenty of fresh water was within their reach. The camp was soon organized. In less than an hour, on the edge of the forest, among the trees, a hut of branches, interlaced with creepers and pasted over with clay, offered a tolerable shelter. Their geological researches were put off till the next day. Supper was prepared. A good fire blazed before the hut. The roast turned, and at 8 o'clock, while one of the settlers watched to keep up the fire, in case any wild beasts should prowl in the neighborhood, the others slept soundly. The next day, the 21st of April, Cyrus Harding, accompanied by Herbert, went to look for the soil of ancient formation, on which he had already discovered a specimen of ore. They found the vein above the ground, near the source of the creek, at the foot of one of the northeastern spurs. This ore, very rich in iron, enclosed in its fusible veinstone, was perfectly suited to the mode of reduction in which the engineer intended to employ. That is, the Catalan method, but simplified, as it is used in Corsica. In fact, the Catalan method, properly so called, requires the construction of kilns and crucibles, in which the ore and the coal, placed in alternate layers, are transformed and reduced. But Cyrus Harding intended to economize these constructions, and wished simply to form, with the ore and the coal, a cubic mass, to the center of which he would direct the wind from his bellows. Doubtless, it was the proceeding employed by Tubal-Cain and the first metallurgists of the inhabited world. Now, that which had succeeded with the grandson of Adam, and which still yielded good results in countries rich in ore and fuel, could not but succeed with the settlers of Lincoln Island. The coal, as well as the ore, was collected without trouble on the surface of the ground. They first broke the ore into little pieces, and cleansed them with the hand from the impurities which soiled the surface. Then coal and ore were arranged in heaps and in successive layers, as the charcoal burner does with wood, which he wishes to carbonize. In this way, under the influence of the air projected by the blowing machine, the coal would be transformed into carbonic acid, then into oxide of carbon, its use being to reduce the oxide of iron, that is to say, to rid it of the oxygen. Thus the engineer proceeded. The bellows of sealskin, furnished at its extremity with a nozzle of clay, which had been previously fabricated in the pottery kiln, was established near the heap of ore. Using the mechanism, which consisted of a frame, cords of fiber, and a counterpoise, he threw into the mass an abundance of air, which by raising the temperature also concurred with a chemical transformation to produce in time pure iron. The operation was difficult. All the patience and all the ingenuity of the settlers was needed, but at last it succeeded, and the result was a lump of iron, reduced to a spongy state, which it was necessary to shingle and faggot, that is to say, to forge, so as to expel from it the liquefied veinstone. These amateur smiths had, of course, no hammer, but they were in no worse a situation than the first metallurgist, and therefore did what, no doubt, he had to do. A handle was fixed to the first lump, and was used as a hammer to forge the second on a granite anvil, and thus they obtained a coarse but useful metal. At length, after many trials and much fatigue, on the 25th of April, several bars of iron were forged and transformed into tools. Crowbars, pincers, pickaxes, spades, etc., which Pencroft and Neb declared to be real jewels. But the metal was not yet in its most serviceable state, that is, of steel. Now, steel is a combination of iron and coal, which is extracted either from the liquid ore by taking it from the excess of coal, or from the iron by adding it to the coal which was wanting. The first, obtained by the decarburation of the metal, gives natural or puddled steel. The second, produced by carburation of the iron, gives steel of cementation. It was the last which Cyrus Harding intended to forge, as he possessed iron in a pure state. He succeeded by heating the metal with powdered coal in a crucible which had previously been manufactured from clay suitable for the purpose. He then worked this steel, which is malleable both when hot or cold, with the hammer. Neb and Pencroft, cleverly directed, made hatchets, which, heated red hot and plunged suddenly into cold water, acquired an excellent temper. Other instruments, of course roughly fashioned, were also manufactured. Blades for planes, axes, hatchets, pieces of steel to be transformed into saws, chisels, then iron for spades, pickaxes, hammers, nails, etc. At last, on the 5th of May, the metallic period ended. The smiths returned to the chimneys, and new work would soon authorize them to take a fresh title. That's the end of chapter 15. We're in the sort of dense period of the book where there's a lot of science-y-ish stuff going on, and the engineers showing off, and everything seems to be going very well and very easily. They're working hard. They're all doing what they can, but they're all very well set up and able to do everything that's needed exactly as needed, and they just so happen to have coal and iron together. It's all very convenient. So I'm sure we'll find some nefarious turn before long. Okay, so we will carry on now to chapter 16. It was the 6th of May, a day which corresponds to the 6th of November in the countries of the Northern Hemisphere. The sky had been obscured for some days, and it was of importance to make preparations for the winter. However, the temperature was not yet much lower, and a centigrade thermometer, transported to Lincoln Island, would still have marked an average of 10 to 12 degrees above zero. This was not surprising, since Lincoln Island, probably situated between the 35th and 40th parallel, would be subject, in the southern hemisphere, to the same climate as Sicily or Greece in the northern hemisphere. But as Greece and Sicily have severe cold, producing snow and ice, so doubtless would Lincoln Island in the severest part of winter, and it was advisable to provide against it. In any case, if cold did not yet threaten them, the rainy season would begin, and on this lonely island, exposed to all the fury of the elements, in mid-ocean, bad weather would be frequent, and probably terrible. The question of a more comfortable dwelling than the chimneys must therefore be seriously considered and promptly resolved on. Pencroft, naturally, had some predilection for the retreat which he had discovered, but he well understood that another must be found. The chimneys had been already visited by the sea, under circumstances which are known, and it would not do to be exposed again to a similar accident. Besides, added Cyrus Harding, who this day was talking of these things with his companions, we have some precautions to take. Why, the island is not inhabited, said the reporter. That is probable, replied the engineer, although we have not yet explored the interior. But if no human beings are found, I fear that dangerous animals may abound. It is necessary to guard against a possible attack, so that we shall not be obliged to watch every night, or to keep up a fire. And then, my friends, we must foresee everything. We are here in a part of the Pacific often frequented by Malay pirates. What? Said Herbert. At such a distance from land? Yes, my boy, replied the engineer. These pirates are bold sailors, as well as formidable enemies, and we must take measures accordingly. Well, replied Pencroft, we will fortify ourselves against savages with 2 legs, as well as against savages with 4. But, Captain, will it not be best to explore every part of the island before undertaking anything else? That would be best, added Gideon Spilett. Who knows if we might not find on the opposite side one of the caverns which we have searched for in vain here. That is true, replied the engineer, but you forget, my friends, that it will be necessary to establish ourselves in the neighborhood of a watercourse, and that, from the summit of Mount Franklin, we could not see towards the west, either in stream or river. Here, on the contrary, we are placed between the Mercy and Lake Grant, an advantage which must not be neglected. And, besides, this side, looking towards the east, is not exposed to the other, is not exposed as the other is to the trade winds, which in this hemisphere blow from the northwest. Then, Captain, replied the sailor, let us build a house on the edge of the lake. Neither bricks nor tools are wanting now. After having been brickmakers, potters, smelters, and smiths, we shall surely know how to be masons. Yes, my friend, but before coming to any decision, we must consider the matter thoroughly. A natural dwelling would spare us much work, and would be a surer retreat, for it would be as well defended against the enemies from the interior as from those outside. That is true, Cyrus, replied the reporter, but we have already examined all that mass of granite, and there is not a hole, not a cranny. No, not one, added Pencroft. Ah, if we were able to dig out a dwelling in that cliff, at a good height, so as to be out of reach of harm, that would be capital. I can see that on the front, which looks seaward, 5 or 6 rooms, with windows to light them, said Herbert, laughing, and a staircase to climb up to them, added Neb. You are laughing, cried the sailor, and why? What is there impossible in what I propose? Haven't we got pickaxes and spades? Won't Captain Harding be able to make powder to blow up the mine? Isn't it true, Captain, that you will make us powder the very day we want it? Cyrus Harding listened to the enthusiastic Pencroft developing his fanciful projects. To attack this mass of granite, even by a mine, was Herculean work, and it was really vexing that nature could not help them at their need. But the engineer did not reply to the sailor except by proposing to examine the cliff more attentively, from the mouth of the river to the angle which terminated it on the north. They went out, therefore, and the exploration was made with extreme care, over an extent of nearly 2 miles. But in no place in the bare, straight cliff could any cavity be found. The nests of the rock pigeons which fluttered at its summit were only, in reality, holes bored at the very top, and on the irregular edge of the granite. It was a provoking circumstance, and as to attacking this cliff, either with pickaxe or with powder, so as to effect a sufficient excavation, it was not to be thought of. It so happened that, on all this part of the shore, Pencroft had discovered the only habitable shelter, that is to say, the Chimneys, which now had to be abandoned. The exploration ended, the colonists found themselves at the north angle of the cliff, where it terminated in long slopes which died away on the shore. From this place to its extreme limit in the west, it only formed a sort of declivity, a thick mass of stones, earth, and sand, bound together by plants, bushes, and grass, inclined at an angle of only 45 degrees. Clumps of trees grew on these slopes, which were also carpeted with thick grass, but the vegetation did not extend far, and a long sandy plain, which began at the foot of these slopes, reached to the beach. Cyrus Harding thought, not without reason, that the overplus of the lake must overflow on this side. The excess of water furnished by the Red Creek must also escape by some channel or other. Now, the engineer had not yet found this channel on any part of the shore already explored. That is to say, from the mouth of the stream on the west of Prospect Heights. The engineer now proposed to his companions to climb the slope, and to return to the Chimneys by the heights, while exploring the northern and southern shores of the lake. The proposal was accepted, and in a few minutes Herbert and Neb were on the upper plateau. Cyrus Harding, Gideon Spilett, and Pencroft followed with more sedate steps. The beautiful sheet of water glittered through the trees under the rays of the sun. In this direction the country was charming. The eye feasted on the groups of trees. Some old trunks, bent with age, showed black against the verdant grass which covered the ground. Crowds of brilliant cockatoos screamed among the branches, moving prisms hopping from one bough to another. The settlers instead of going directly to the north bank of the lake, made a circuit round the edge of the plateau, so as to join the mouth of the creek on its left bank. It was a detour of more than a mile and a half. Walking was easy, for the trees widely spread, left a considerable space between them. The fertile zone evidently stopped at this point, and vegetation would be less vigorous in the part between the course of the creek and the Mersey. Cyrus Harding and his companions walked over this new ground with great care. Bows, arrows, and sticks with sharp iron points were their only weapons. However, no wild beast showed itself, and it was probable that these animals frequented rather the thick forests in the south. But the settlers had the disagreeable surprise of seeing Top stop before a snake of great size, measuring from 14 to 15 feet in length. Neb killed it by a blow from his stick. Cyrus Harding examined the reptile and declared it not venomous, for it belonged to that species of diamond serpents which the natives of South Wales rear. But it was possible that others existed whose bite was mortal, such as the deaf vipers with forked tails, which rise up under the feet, or those winged snakes furnished with 2 ears, which enable them to proceed with great rapidity. Top, the first moment of surprise over, began a reptile chase with such eagerness that they feared for his safety. His master called him back directly. The mouth of the Red Creek, at the place where it entered into the lake, was soon reached. The explorers recognized on the opposite shore the point which they had visited on their descent from Mount Franklin. Cyrus Harding ascertained that the flow of water into it from the creek was considerable. Nature must therefore have provided some place for the escape of the overplus. This doubtless formed a fall, which, if it could be discovered, would be of great use. The colonists, walking apart, but not straying far from each other, began to skirt the edge of the lake, which was very steep. The water appeared to be full of fish, and Pencroft resolved to make some fishing rods, so as to try and catch some. The northeast point was first to be doubled. It might have been supposed that the discharge of water was at this place, for the extremity of the lake was almost on a level with the edge of the plateau, but no signs of this were discovered, and the colonists continued to explore the bank, which, after a slight bend, descended parallel to the shore. On this side, the banks were less woody, but clumps of trees, here and there, added to the picturesqueness of the country. Lake Grant was viewed from thence in all its extent, and no breath disturbed the surface of its waters. Top, in beating the bushes, put up flocks of birds of different kinds, which Gideon Spilett and Herbert saluted with arrows. One was hit by the lead and fell into some marshy grass. Top rushed forward and brought a beautiful swimming bird of a slate color, short beak, very developed frontal plate, and wings edged with white. It was a coot, the size of a large partridge, belonging to a group of macrodactyls, which form the transition between the order of wading birds and that of palmipeds. Sorry game, in truth, and its flavor is far from pleasant, but Top was not so particular in these things as his masters, and it was agreed that the coot should be for his supper. The settlers were now following the eastern bank of the lake, and they would not be long in reaching the part which they already knew. The engineer was much surprised at not seeing any indication of the discharge of water. The reporter and the sailor talked with him, and he could not conceal his astonishment. At this moment, Top, who had been very quiet till then, gave signs of agitation. The intelligent animal went backwards and forwards on the shore, stopped suddenly, then looked at the water, one paw raised, as if he was pointing at some invisible game. Then he barked furiously and was suddenly silent. Neither Cyrus Harding nor his companions had at first paid any attention to Top's behavior, but the dog's barking soon became so frequent that the engineer noticed it. "What is there, Top?" he asked. The dog bounded towards his master, seeming to be very uneasy, then rushed again towards the bank. Then, all at once, he plunged into the lake. "Here, Top!" cried Cyrus Harding, who did not like his dog to venture into the treacherous water. "What's happening down there?" asked Pencroft, examining the surface of the lake. "Top smells some amphibious creature," replied Herbert. "An alligator, perhaps," said the reporter. "I do not think so," replied Harding. "Alligators are only met with in regions less elevated in latitude." Meanwhile, Top had returned at his master's call. and had regained the shore, but he could not stay quiet. He plunged in among the tall grass, and guided by instinct, he appeared to follow some invisible being which was slipping along under the surface of the water. However, the water was calm. Not a ripple disturbed its surface. Several times the settlers stopped on the bank and observed it attentively. Nothing appeared. There was some mystery here. The engineer was puzzled. "Let us pursue this exploration to the end," said he. Half an hour after they had all arrived at the southeast angle of the lake, on Prospect Heights. At this point, the examination of the banks of the lake was considered finished, and yet the engineer had not been able to discover how and where the waters were discharged. "There is no doubt this overflow exists," he repeated, "and since it is not visible, it must go through the granite cliff at the west." "But what importance do you attach to knowing that, my dear Cyrus?" asked Gideon Spilett. "Considerable importance," replied the engineer, "for if it flows through the cliff, there is probably some cavity, which it would be easy to render habitable after turning away the water." "But is it not possible, Captain, that the water flows away at the bottom of the lake?" said Herbert, "and that it reaches the sea by some subterranean passage?" "That might be," replied the engineer, "and should it be so, we shall be obliged to build our house ourselves, since nature has not done it for us." The colonists were about to begin to traverse the plateau to return to the Chimneys, when Top gave new signs of agitation. He barked with fury, and before his masters could restrain him, he had plunged a second time into the lake. All ran towards the bank. The dog was already more than 20 feet off, and Cyrus was calling him back, when an enormous head emerged from the water, which did not appear to be deep in that place. Herbert recognized directly the species of amphibian to which the tapering head, with large eyes and adorned with long silky mustaches, belonged. "A lamantine!" he cried. It was not a lamantine, but one of that species of the order of cetaceans, which bear the name of the dugong, for its nostrils were open at the upper part of its snout. The enormous animal rushed on the dog, who tried to escape by returning towards the shore. His master could do nothing to save him, and before Gideon Spilett or Herbert thought of bending their bows, Top, seized by the dugong, had disappeared beneath the water. Neb, his iron-tipped spear in his hand, wished to go to Top's help and attack the dangerous animal in its own element. "No, Neb," said the engineer, restraining his courageous servant. Meanwhile, a struggle was going on beneath the water, an inexplicable struggle, for in his situation, Top could not possibly resist. And judging by the bubbling of the surface, it must also be a terrible struggle, and could not but terminate in the death of the dog. But suddenly, in the middle of a foaming circle, Top reappeared. Thrown in the air by some unknown power, he rose 10 feet above the surface of the lake, fell again into the midst of the agitated waters, and soon gained the shore, without any severe wounds, miraculously saved. Cyrus Harding and his companions could not understand it. What was not less inexplicable was that the struggle still appeared to be going on. Doubtless the dugong, attacked by some powerful animal, after having released the dog, was fighting on its own account. But it did not last long. The water became red with blood, and the body of the dugong, emerging from the sheet of scarlet which spread around, soon stranded on a little beach at the south angle of the lake. The colonists ran toward it. The dugong was dead. It was an enormous animal, 15 or 16 feet long, and must have weighed from 3,000 to 4,000 pounds. At its neck was a wound, which appeared to have been produced by a sharp blade. What could the amphibious creature have been, who, by this terrible blow, had destroyed the formidable dugong? No one could tell, and much interested in this incident, Harding and his companions returned to the Chimneys. So we've got things happening now. Sorry, that was the end of chapter 16. So there's things happening. They're exploring more, and they're finding the unknown. There's something else besides them. They finally had some encounters with some dangerous creatures. There was the snake, there was the dugong, and something else. And somehow Top just managed to pop right out the water. All right. Let's get another chapter in, I think, before I have to take a break. So let's keep on keeping on. That brings us to chapter 17. The next day, the 7th of May, Harding and Gideon Spilett, leaving Neb to prepare breakfast, climbed Prospect Heights, while Herbert and Pencroft ascended by the river to renew their store of wood. The engineer and the reporter soon reached the little beach on which the dugong had been stranded. Already, flocks of birds had attacked the mass of flesh, and had to be driven away with stones, for Cyrus wished to keep the fat for the use of the colony. As to the animal's flesh, it would furnish excellent food, for in the islands of the Malay archipelago and elsewhere, it was especially reserved for the table of the native princes. But that was Neb's affair. At this moment, Cyrus Harding had other thoughts, as he was much interested in the incident of the day before. He wished to penetrate the mystery of that submarine combat, and to ascertain what monster could have given the dugong so strange a wound. He remained at the edge of the lake, looking, observing, but nothing appeared under the tranquil waters, which sparkled in the first rays of the sun. At the beach, on which lay the body of the dugong, the water was tolerably shallow, but from this point the bottom of the lake sloped gradually, and it was probable that the depth was considerable in the center. The lake might be considered as a large center basin, which was filled by the water from the Red Creek. "Well, Cyrus," said the reporter, "there seems to be nothing suspicious in this water." "No, my dear Spilett," replied the engineer, "and I really do not know how to account for the incident of yesterday." "I apologize," returned Spilett, "that the wound given this creature is, at least, very strange, and I cannot explain either how Top was so vigorously cast up out of the water. One could have thought that a powerful arm hurled him up, and that the same arm, with a dagger, killed the dugong." "Yes," replied the engineer, who had become thoughtful, "there is something there that I cannot understand." "But do you better understand either, my dear Spilett, in what way I was saved myself? How I was drawn from the waves and carried to the downs? No, is it not true? Now I feel sure that there is some mystery there, which doubtless we shall discover some day. Let us observe, but do not dwell on these singular incidents before our companions. Let us keep our remarks to ourselves, and continue our work." It will be remembered that the engineer had not as yet been able to discover the place where the surplus water escaped, but he knew it must exist somewhere. He was much surprised to see a strong current at this place. By throwing in some bits of wood, he found that it set towards the southern angle. He followed the current and arrived at the south point of the lake. There was a sort of depression in the water, as if it was suddenly lost in some fissure in the ground. Harding listened, placing his ear to the level of the lake. He very distinctly heard the noise of a subterranean fall. "There," said he, rising, "is the discharge of the water. There, doubtless, by a passage in the granite cliff, it joins the sea, through cavities which we can use to our profit. Well, I can find it." The engineer cut a long branch, stripped of its leaves, and, plunging it into the angle between the two banks, he found that there was a large hole 1 foot only beneath the surface of the water. This hole was the opening so long looked for in vain, and the force of the current was such that the branch was torn from the engineer's hands and disappeared. "There is no doubt about it now," repeated Harding. "There is the outlet, and I will lay it open to view." "How?" asked Gideon Spilett. "By lowering the level of the water of the lake 3 feet. "And how will you lower the level?" "By opening another outlet, larger than this." "At what place, Cyrus?" "At the part of the bank nearest the coast." "But it is a mass of granite," observed Spilett. "Well," replied Cyrus Harding, "I will blow up the granite, and the water escaping will subside so as to lay bare this opening." "And make a waterfall by falling onto the beach," added the reporter. "A fall that we shall make use of," replied Cyrus. "Come, come." The engineer hurried away his companion, whose confidence in Harding was such that he did not doubt the enterprise would succeed. And yet, how was this granite wall to be opened without powder, and with imperfect instruments? Was not this work upon which the engineer was so bent above their strength? When Harding and the reporter entered the chimneys, they found Herbert and Pencroft unloading their raft of wood. "The woodmen have just finished, Captain," said the sailor, laughing. "And when you want masons—" "Masons, no, but chemists," replied the engineer. "Yes," added the reporter, "we are going to blow up the island." "Blow up the island!" cried Pencroft. "Part of it, at least," replied Spilett. "Listen to me, my friends," said the engineer, and he made known to them the result of his observations. According to him, a cavity, more or less considerable, must exist in the mass of granite which supported Prospect Heights, and he intended to penetrate into it. To do this, the opening through which the water rushed must first be cleared, and the level lowered by making a larger outlet. Therefore, an explosive substance must be manufactured, which would make a deep trench in some other part of the shore. This was what Harding was going to attempt with the minerals which nature placed at his disposal. It is useless to say that with what enthusiasm all, especially Pencroft, received this project. To employ great means, open the granite, create a cascade, that suited the sailor, and he would just as soon be a chemist as a mason or a bootmaker, since the engineer wanted chemicals. He would be all that they liked, even a professor of dancing and deportment, he said to Neb, if that was ever necessary. Neb and Pencroft were first of all to extract the grease from the dugong, and to keep the flesh, which was destined for food. Such perfect confidence had they in the engineer that they set out directly, without even asking a question. A few minutes after them, Cyrus Harding, Herbert, and Gideon Spilett, dragging the hurdle, went towards the vein of coals, where those schistose pyrites around which are met with in the most recent transition soil, and of which Harding had already found a specimen. All the day being employed in carrying a quantity of these stones to the chimneys, by evening they had several tons. The next day, the 8th of May, the engineer began his manipulations. These schistose pyrites, being composed principally of coal, flint, alumina, and sulphuret of iron, the latter in excess, it was necessary to separate the sulphuret of iron and transform it into sulfate as rapidly as possible. The sulfate obtained, the sulfuric acid could then be extracted. This was the object to be obtained. Sulfuric acid is one of the agents the most frequently employed, and the manufacturing importance of a nation can be measured by the consumption which is made of it. This acid would later be of great use to the settlers, in the manufacturing of candles, tanning skins, etc. But this time the engineer reserved it for another use. Cyrus Harding chose, behind the chimneys, a site where the ground was perfectly level. On this ground he placed a layer of branches and chopped wood, on which were piled some pieces of schistose pyrites, buttressed one against the other, the whole being covered with a thin layer of pyrites, previously reduced to the size of a nut. This done, they set fire to the wood. The heat was communicated to the schist, which soon kindled, since it contains coal and sulfur. Then new layers of bruised pyrites were arranged so as to form an immense heap, the exterior of which was covered with earth and grass, several air holes being left, as if it was a stack of wood which was to be carbonized to make charcoal. They then left the transformation to complete itself, and it would not take less than 10 or 12 days for the sulfate of iron to be changed to sulfate of iron, and the alumina into sulfate of alumina, two equally soluble substances, the others, flint, burnt coal, and cinders, not being so. While this chemical work was going on, Cyrus Harding proceeded with other operations, which were pursued with more than zeal. It was eagerness. Neb and Pencroft had taken away the fat from the dugong, and placed it in large earthen pots. It was then necessary to separate the glycerin from the fat by saponifying it. Now, to obtain this result, it had to be treated either with soda or lime. In fact, one or other of these substances, after having attacked the fat, would form a soap by separating the glycerin. And it was just this glycerin which the engineer wished to obtain. There was no want of lime, only treatment by lime could give a calcareous soap, insoluble, and consequently useless, while treatment by soda would furnish, on the contrary, a soluble soap, which could be put to do domestic use. Now, a practical man, like Cyrus Harding, would rather try to obtain soda. Was this difficult? No. for marine plants abounded on the shore: glasswort, uh, ficoids, and all those fucaceae which form wrack. A large quantity of these plants was collected, first dried, then burnt in holes in the open air. The combustion of these plants was kept up for several days, and the result was a compact gray mass, which had been long known under the name of natural soda. This obtained, the engineer treated the fat with soda, which gave both a soluble soap and that neutral substance, glycerin. But this was not all. Cyrus Harding still needed, in view of his future preparation, another substance, nitrate of potash, which is better known under the name of salt niter or saltpeter. Cyrus Harding could have manufactured this substance by treating the carbonate of potash, which would be easily extracted from the cinders of the vegetables, by azotic acid, but this acid was wanting, and he would have been in some difficulty if nature had not happily furnished the saltpeter without giving him any other trouble than that of picking it up. Herbert found a vein of it at the foot of Mount Franklin, and they had nothing to do but purify this salt. These different works lasted a week. They were finished before the transformation of the sulphuret into sulfate of iron had been accomplished. During the following days, the settlers had time to construct a furnace of bricks, of a particular arrangement, to serve for the distillation of the sulfate of iron when it had been obtained. All this was finished around about the 18th of May, nearly at the time when the chemical transformation terminated. Gideon Spilett, Herbert, Neb, and Pencroft, skillfully directed by the engineer, had become the most clever workmen. Before all masters, necessity is the one most listened to, and who teaches the best. When the heap of pyrites had been entirely reduced by fire, the result of the operation, consisting of sulfate of iron, sulfate of alumina, flint, remains of coal, and cinders, was placed in a basin full of water. They stirred this mixture, let it settle, then decanted it, and obtained a very clear liquid containing in solution sulfate of iron and sulfate of alumina, the other matters remaining solid, since they are insoluble. Lastly, this liquid being partly evaporated, crystals of sulfate of iron were deposited, and the not evaporated liquid, which contained the sulfate of alumina, was thrown away. Cyrus Harding now had at his disposal a large quantity of these sulfate of iron crystals, from which the sulfuric acid had to be extracted. The making of sulfuric acid is a very expensive manufacture. Considerable works are necessary, a special set of tools, an apparatus of platina, leaden chambers, unassailable by the acid, and in which the transformation is performed, etc. The engineer had none of these at his disposal, but he knew that, in Bohemia especially, sulfuric acid is manufactured by very simple means, which have also the advantage of producing it to a superior degree of concentration. It is thus that the acid known under the name of Nordhausen acid is made. To obtain sulfuric acid, Cyrus Harding had only one operation to make: to calcine the sulfate of iron crystals in a closed vase, so that the sulfuric acid should distill in vapor, which vapor, by condensation, would produce the acid. The crystals were placed in pots, and the heat from the furnace would distill the sulfuric acid. The operation was successfully completed, and on the 20th of May, 12 days after commencing it, the engineer was the possessor of the agent which later he hoped to use in so many different ways. Now, why did he wish for this agent? Simply to produce azotic acid. And that was easy, since saltpeter attacked by sulfuric acid gives azotic or nitric acid by distillation. But, after all, how was he going to employ this azotic acid? His companions were still ignorant of this, for he had not informed them of the result at which he aimed. However, the engineer had nearly accomplished his purpose, and by a last operation he would procure the substance which had given so much trouble. Taking some azotic acid, he mixed it with glycerin, which had been previously concentrated by evaporation, subjected to the water bath, and he obtained, without even employing a refrigerant mixture, several pints of an oily yellow mixture. This last operation Cyrus Harding had made alone, in a retired place, at a distance from the chimneys, for he feared the danger of an explosion. and when he showed a bottle of this liquid to his friends, he contented himself saying, "Here is nitroglycerin." It was really this terrible production, of which the explosive powder is perhaps tenfold that of ordinary powder, and which has already caused so many accidents. However, since a way has been found to transform it into dynamite, that is to say, to mix it with some solid substance, clay or sugar, porous enough to hold it, the dangerous liquid has been used with some security. But dynamite was not yet known at the time when the settlers worked on Lincoln Island. "And is it that liquid that is going to blow up our rocks?" said Pencroft incredulously. "Yes, my friend," replied the engineer, "and this nitroglycerin will produce so much the more effect, as the granite is extremely hard, and will oppose a greater resistance to the explosion." "And when shall we see this, Captain?" "Tomorrow, as soon as we have dug a hole for the mine," replied the engineer. The next day, the 21st of May, at daybreak, the miners went to the point which formed the eastern shore of Lake Grant, and was only 500 feet from the coast. At this place, the plateau inclined downwards from the waters, which were only restrained by their granite case. Therefore, if this case was broken, the water would escape by the opening and form a stream, which, flowing over the inclined surface of the plateau, would rush on to the beach. Consequently, the level of the lake would be greatly lowered, and the opening where the water escaped would be exposed, which was their final aim. Under the engineer's direction, Pencroft, armed with a pickaxe, which he handled skillfully and vigorously, attacked the granite. The hole was made on the point of the shore, slanting, so that it would meet a much lower level than that of the water in the lake. In this way, the explosive force, by scattering the rock, would open a large place for the water to rush out. The work took some time, for the engineer, wishing to produce a great effect, intended to devote not less than 7 quarts of nitroglycerin to the operation. But Pencroft, relieved by Neb, did so well that towards 4 o'clock in the evening the mine was finished. Now, the question of setting fire to the explosive substance was raised. Generally, nitroglycerin is ignited by caps of fulminate, which, in bursting, cause the explosion. A shock is therefore needed to produce the explosion, for, simply lighted, this substance would burn without exploding. Cyrus Harding could certainly have fabricated a percussion cap. In default of fulminate, he could easily obtain a substance similar to gun cotton, since he had azotic acid at his disposal. This substance, pressed in a cartridge and introduced among the nitroglycerin, would burst by means of a fuse and cause the explosion. But Cyrus Harding knew that nitroglycerin would explode by a shock. He resolved to employ this means and try another way, if this did not succeed. In fact, the blow of a hammer on a few drips of nitroglycerin spread out on a hard surface was enough to create an explosion. But the operator did not have to be there to give the blow, without becoming a victim to the operation. Harding, therefore, thought of suspending a mass of iron, weighing several pounds, by means of a fiber, to an upright just above the mine. Another long fiber, previously impregnated with sulfur, was attached to the middle of the first, by one end, while the other lay on the ground several feet distant from the mine. The second fiber, being set on fire, it would burn till it reached the first. This, catching fire in its turn, would break, and the mass of iron would fall onto the nitroglycerin. This apparatus being then arranged, the engineer, after having sent his companions to a distance, filled the hole so that the nitroglycerin was on a level with the opening. Then he threw a few drops of it on the surface of the rock, above which the mass of iron was already suspended. This done, Harding lit the end of the sulfured fiber, and, leaving the place, he returned with his companions to the Chimneys. The fiber was intended to burn 25 minutes, and in fact, 25 minutes afterwards, a most tremendous explosion was heard. The island appeared to tremble to its very foundation. The stones were projected in the air as if by the eruption of a volcano. The shock produced by the displacing of the air was such that the rocks of the Chimneys shook. The settlers, although they were more than 2 miles from the mine, were thrown on the ground. They rose, climbed the plateau, and ran towards the place where the bank of the lake must have been shattered by the explosion. A cheer escaped them. A large rent was seen in the granite. A rapid stream of water rushed, foaming across the plateau, and dashed down a height of 300 feet onto the beach. Are we reading Verne, or is this the Anarchist Cookbook? All right, that is the end of chapter 17, and I'm going to take a quick break. Bit of a stuffed nose, and I could use a top up of my drink. So we'll take a few minutes here, and I'll yeah, definitely need a don't try this at home disclaimer. This now kids. All right, I'll be back in just a minute. Okay, we are back, and I'll just update my drink here. I've got a little bit of congestion tonight, so updating with a little bit of something with some carbonation to see if that knocks anything loose. Just plain old Diet Coke. Alright, so we've got about, half hour, 40 minutes or so before I need to wrap up, so we can get through probably another 2-3 chapters at this rate. We're making pretty good progress through this. So let's just go ahead and get right back to it. We have, I mean, maybe, but it's Tuesday. Alright, so it brings us back to chapter 18. Cyrus Harding's project had succeeded, but according to his usual habit, he showed no satisfaction. With closed lips and a fixed look, he remained motionless. Herbert was in ecstasies. Neb bounded with joy. Pencroft nodded his great head, murmuring these words: "Come, our engineer gets on capitally." The nitroglycerin had indeed acted powerfully. The opening which it had made was so large that the volume of water which escaped through this new outlet was at least treble that which before had passed through the old one. The result was that a short time after the operation, the level of the lake would be lowered 2 feet or more. The settlers went on to the chimneys to take some pickaxes, iron-tipped spears, string made of fibers, flint and steel. They then returned to the plateau, Top accompanying them. On the way, the sailor could not help saying to the engineer, "Don't you think, Captain, that by means of that charming liquid you have made, one could blow up the whole of our island?" "Without any doubt, the island, continents, and the world itself," replied the engineer. "It is only a question of quantity." "Then, could you not use this nitroglycerin for loading firearms?" asked the sailor. "No, Pencroft, for it is too explosive a substance. But it would be easy to make some gun cotton, or even ordinary powder, as we have azotic acid, saltpeter, sulfur, and coal. Unhappily, it is the guns which we have not got." "Oh, Captain," replied the sailor, "with a little determination." Pencroft had erased the word impossible from the dictionary of Lincoln Island. The settlers, having arrived at Prospect Heights, went immediately towards that point of the lake near which was the old opening now uncovered. This outlet had now become practicable, since the water no longer rushed through it, and it would doubtless be easy to explore the interior. In a few minutes, the settlers had reached the lower point of the lake, and a glance showed them that the object had been attained. In fact, in the side of the lake, and now above the surface of the water, appeared the long-looked-for opening. A narrow ridge, left bared by the retreat of the water, allowed them to approach it. This orifice was nearly 20 feet in width, but scarcely 2 in height. It was like the mouth of a drain at the edge of the pavement, and therefore did not offer an easy passage to the settlers, but Neb and Pencroft, taking their pickaxes, soon made it of a suitable height. The engineer then approached, and found that the sides of the opening, in its upper part at least, had not a slope of more than 30 to 35 degrees. It was therefore practicable, and provided that the declivity did not increase, it would be easy to descend, even to the level of the sea. If then, as was probable, some vast cavity existed in the interior of the granite, it might perhaps be of great use. "Well, Captain, what are we stopping for?" asked the sailor, impatient to enter the narrow passage. "You see Top has got before us." "Very well," replied the engineer, "but we must see our way. Neb, go and cut some resinous branches." Neb and Herbert ran to the edge of the lake, shaded with pines and other green trees, and soon returned with some branches, which they made into torches. The torches were lighted with flint and steel, and Cyrus Harding, leading, the settlers ventured into the dark passage, which the overplus of the lake had formerly filled. Contrary to what might have been supposed, the diameter of the passage increased as the explorers proceeded, so that they very soon were able to stand upright. The granite, worn by the water for an infinite time, was very slippery, and the walls were to be dreaded. But the settlers were all attached to each other by a cord, as is frequently done in ascending mountains. Happily, some projections of the granite, forming regular steps, made the descent less perilous. Drops, still hanging from the rocks, shone here and there under the light of the torches, and the explorers guessed that the sides were soaked with innumerable stalactites. The engineer examined the black granite. There was not a stratum, not a break in it. The mass was compact, and of an extremely close grain. The passage dated, then, from the very origin of the island. It was not the water which little by little had hollowed it. Pluto, and not Neptune, had bored it with his own hand, and on the wall traces of an eruptive work could be distinguished, which all the washing of the water had not been able to totally efface. The settlers descended very slowly. They could not but feel a certain awe in this venturing into the unknown depths, for the first time visited by human beings. They did not speak, but they thought, and the thought came to more than one, that some polypus or other gigantic cephalopod might inhabit the interior cavities, which were in communication with the sea. However, Top kept at the head of the little band, and they could rely on the sagacity of the dog, who would not fail to give the alarm if there were any need for it. After having descended about 100 feet, following a winding road, Harding, who was walking on before, stopped, and his companions came up with him. The place where they had halted was wider, so as to form a cavern of moderate dimensions. Drops of water fell from the vault, but that did not prove that they oozed through the rock. They were simply the last traces left by the torrent which had so long thundered through this cavity, and the air there was pure, though slightly damp, but producing no mephitic exhalation. "Well, my dear Cyrus," said Gideon Spilett, "here is a very secure retreat, well hid in the depths of the rock. But it is, however, uninhabitable." "Why uninhabitable?" asked the sailor. "Because it is too small and too dark." "Couldn't we enlarge it, hollow it out, and make openings to let in light and air?" replied Pencroft, who now thought nothing impossible. "Let us go on with our exploration," said Cyrus Harding. "Perhaps lower down, nature will have spared us this labor." "We have only gone a third of the way," observed Herbert. "Nearly a third," replied Harding, "for we have descended 100 feet from the opening, and it is not impossible that 100 feet further down—" "Where is Top?" asked Neb, interrupting his master. They searched the cavern, but the dog was not there. "Most likely he has gone on. Let us join him," replied Harding. The descent was continued. The engineer carefully observed all the deviations of the passage, and, notwithstanding so many detours, he could easily have given an account of its general direction, which went towards the sea. The settlers had gone some 50 feet further, when their attention was attracted by distant sounds which came up from the depths. They stopped and listened. These sounds, carried through the passage as though through an acoustic tube, came clearly to the ear. "That is Top barking!" cried Herbert. "Yes," replied Pencroft, "and our brave dog is barking furiously." "We have our iron-tipped spears," said Cyrus Harding. "Keep on your guard, and forward." It is becoming more and more interesting," murmured Gideon Spilett in the sailor's ear, who nodded. Harding and his companions rushed to the help of their dog. Top's barking became more and more perceptible, and it seemed strangely fierce. Was he engaged in a struggle with some animal whose retreat he had disturbed? Without thinking of the danger to which they might be exposed, the explorers were now impelled by an irresistible curiosity, and in a few minutes, 16 feet lower, they rejoined Top. There, the passage ended in a vast and magnificent cavern. Top was running backwards and forwards, barking furiously. Pencroft and Neb, waving their torches, threw the light into every crevice, and at the same time, Harding, Gideon Spilett, and Herbert, their spears raised, were ready for any emergency which might arise. The enormous cavern was empty. The settlers explored it in every direction, but there was nothing there, not an animal, not a human being, and yet Top continued to bark. Neither caresses nor threats could make him be silent. "There must be a place somewhere by which the waters of the lake reach to the sea," said the engineer. "Of course," replied Pencroft, "and we must take care not to tumble into a hole." Go, Top, go! Cried Harding. The dog, excited by his master's words, ran towards the extremity of the cavern, and there redoubled his barking. They followed him, and by the light of the torches perceived the mouth of a regular well in the granite. It was by this that the water escaped, and this time it was not an oblique and practicable passage, but a perpendicular well, into which it was impossible to venture. The torches were held over the opening. Nothing could be seen. Harding took a lighted branch and threw it into the abyss. The blazing resin, whose illuminating power increased still more by the rapidity of its fall, lighted up the interior of the well, but yet nothing appeared. The flame then went out with a slight hiss, which showed that it had reached the water, that is to say, the level of the sea. The engineer, calculating the time employed in its fall, was able to calculate the depth of the well, which was found to be about 90 feet. The floor of the cavern must thus be situated 90 feet above the level of the sea. Here is our dwelling, said Cyrus Harding. But it was occupied by some creature, replied Gideon Spilett, whose curiosity was not yet satisfied. Well, the creature, amphibious or otherwise, has made off through this opening, replied the engineer, and has left the place for us. Never mind, added the sailor. I should like very much to be Top just for a quarter of an hour, for he doesn't bark for nothing. Cyrus Harding looked at his dog, and those of his companions who were near him might have heard him murmur these words. Yes, I believe that Top knows more than we do about a great many things. However, the wishes of the settlers were for the most part satisfied. Chance, aided by the marvelous sagacity of their leader, had done them great service. They had now at their disposal a vast cavern, the size of which could not be properly calculated by the feeble light of their torches. But it would certainly be easy to divide it into rooms, by means of brick partitions, or to use it, if not as a house, at least as a spacious apartment. The water, which had left it, could not return. The place was free. Two difficulties remained. Firstly, the possibility of lighting this excavation in the midst of solid rock. Secondly, the necessity of rendering the means of access more easy. It was useless to think of lighting it from above, because of the enormous thickness of the granite which composed the ceiling. But perhaps the outer wall, next to the sea, might be pierced. Cyrus Harding, during the descent, had roughly calculated its obliqueness, and consequently the length of the passage, and was therefore led to believe that the outer wall could not be very thick. If light was thus obtained, it would be a means of access, for it would be easy to pierce a door. It would be as easy to pierce a door as windows, and to establish an exterior ladder. Harding made known his ideas to his companions. Then, Captain, let us set to work, replied Pencroft. I have my pickaxe, and I shall soon make my way through this wall. Where shall I strike? Here, replied the engineer, showing the sturdy sailor a considerable recess in the side, which would much diminish the thickness. Pencroft attacked the granite for half an hour by the light of the torches. He made the splinters fly around him. Neb relieved him, then Spilett took Neb's place. This work had lasted 2 hours, and they began to fear that at this spot the wall would not yield to the pickaxe. When at last a blow given by Gideon Spilett, the instrument, passing through the rock, fell outside. "Hurrah! Hurrah!" cried Pencroft. The wall only measured there 3 feet in thickness. Harding applied his eye to the aperture, which overlooked the ground from a height of 80 feet. Before him was extended the sea-coast, the islet, and beyond, the open sea. Floods of light entered by this hole, inundating the splendid cavern and producing a magic effect. On its left side it did not measure more than 30 feet in height and breadth, but on the right it was enormous, and its vaulted roof rose to a height of more than 80 feet. In some places, granite pillars, irregularly disposed, supported the vaulted roof, as in those in the nave of a cathedral. Here, forming lateral piers, there, elliptical arches, adorned with pointed moldings. losing themselves in dark bays, amid the fantastic arches, of which glimpses could be caught in the shade, covered with a profusion of projections, formed like so many pendants. This cavern was a picturesque mixture of all the styles of Byzantine, Roman, or Gothic architecture ever produced by the hands of man, and yet this was only the work of nature. She alone had hollowed this fairy Alhambra in a mass of granite. The settlers were overwhelmed with admiration. Where they had only expected to find a narrow cavity, they had found a sort of marvelous place, a palace, and Neb had taken off his hat as if he had been transported into a temple. Cries of admiration issued from every mouth. Hurrahs resounded, and the echo was repeated again and again till it died away in the dark naves. "Ah, my friends," exclaimed Cyrus Harding, "when we have lighted the interior of this place, and have arranged our rooms and storehouses in the lower part, we shall still have this splendid cavern, which we will make our study and our museum." "And we will call it?" asked Herbert. "Granite House," replied Harding, a name which his companions again saluted with a cheer. The torches were now almost consumed, and as they were obliged to return by the passage to reach the summit of the plateau, it was decided to put off the work necessary for the arrangement of their new dwelling till the next day. Before departing, Cyrus Harding leaned once more over the dark well, which descended perpendicularly to the level of the sea. He listened attentively. No noise was heard, not even that of the water, which the undulations of the surge must sometimes agitate in its depths. A flaming branch was again thrown in. The sides of the well were lighted up for an instant, but as at the first time, nothing suspicious was seen. If some marine monster had been surprised unawares by the retreat of the water, he would by this time have regained the sea by the subterranean passage, before the new opening had been offered to him. Meanwhile, the engineer was standing motionless, his eyes fixed on the gulf, without uttering a word. The sailor approached him, and touching his arm, "Captain," said he. "What do you want, my friend?" asked the engineer, as if he had returned from the land of dreams. "The torches will soon go out." "Forward," replied Cyrus Harding. The little band left the cavern and began to ascend through the dark passage. Top closed the rear, still growling every now and then. The ascent was painful enough. The settlers rested a few times in the upper grotto, which made a sort of landing place halfway up the long granite staircase. Then they began to climb again. Soon, fresher air was felt. The drops of water, dried by evaporation, no longer sparkled on the walls. The flaring torches began to grow dim. The one which Neb carried went out, and if they did not wish to find their way in the dark, they must hasten. This was done, and a little before 4 o'clock, at the moment when the sailor's torch went out in its turn, Cyrus Harding and his companions passed out of the passage. That brings us to the end of chapter 18. So yeah, they're found a new home that blown in the side of the lake cave and blast their way through with a pickaxe in the wall to make themselves a window, and there's still mystery. Top is still a suspicious little pooch. So we'll see what else there is to be discovered. The mystery of the island is starting to really come to light. There's more going on beneath the surface than we might have expected. Likely related to how the captain came ashore. But we'll find out soon. Let's try and get one more chapter in tonight. Chapter 19. The next day, the 22nd of May, the arrangement of their new dwelling was commenced. In fact, the settlers longed to exchange the insufficient shelter of the chimneys for this large and healthy retreat in the midst of solid rock, and sheltered from the water, both of the sea and sky. It is. It's a little eponymous there. Their former dwelling was not, however, to be entirely abandoned. for the engineer intended to make a manufactory of it for important works. Cyrus Harding's first care was to find out the position of the front of Granite House from the outside. He went to the beach, and as the pickaxe, when it escaped from the hands of the reporter, must have fallen perpendicularly to the foot of the cliff, the finding it would be sufficient to show the place where the hole had been pierced in the granite. The pickaxe was easily found, and the hole could be seen in a perpendicular line above the spot where it was stuck in the sand. Some rock pigeons were already flying in and out of the narrow opening. They evidently thought that the Granite House had been discovered on purpose for them. It was the engineer's intention to divide the right portion of the cavern into several rooms, preceded by an entrance passage, and to light it by means of 5 windows and a door, pierced in the front. Pencroft was much pleased with the 5 windows, but he could not understand the use of the door, since the passage offered a natural staircase, through which it would always be easy to enter the Granite House. "My friend," replied Harding, "if it is easy for us to reach our dwelling by this passage, it will be equally easy for others besides us. I mean, on the contrary, to block up that opening, to seal it hermetically, and, if it is necessary, to completely hide the entrance by making a dam, and thus causing the water of the lake to rise." "And how shall we get in?" asked the sailor. "By an outside ladder," replied Cyrus Harding. "A rope ladder, which once drawn up, will render access to our dwelling impossible." "But why so many precautions?" asked Pencroft. "As yet we have seen no dangerous animals. As to our island being inhabited by natives, I don't believe it." "Are you quite sure of that, Pencroft?" asked the engineer, looking at the sailor. "Of course, we shall not be quite sure till we have explored it in every direction," replied Pencroft. "Yes," said Harding, "for we know only a small portion of it as yet. But at any rate, if we have no enemies in the interior, they may come from the exterior, for parts of the Pacific are very dangerous. We must be provided against every contingency." Cyrus Harding spoke wisely, and without making any further objection, Pencroft prepared to execute his orders. The front of Granite House was then to be lighted by 5 windows and a door. Besides a large bay window and some smaller oval ones, which would admit plenty of light to enter into the marvelous nave, which was to be their chief room. This facade, situated at a height of 80 feet above the ground, was exposed to the east, and the rising sun saluted it with its first rays. It was found to be just at that part of the cliff which was between the projection at the mouth of the Mercy and a perpendicular line traced from the heap of rocks which formed the chimneys. Thus, the winds from the northeast would only strike it obliquely, for it was protected by the projection. Besides, until the windows frames were made, the engineer meant to close the openings with thick shutters, which would prevent either wind or rain from entering, and which could be concealed in need. The first work was to make the openings. This would have taken too long with a pickaxe alone, and it is known that Harding was an ingenious man. He had still a quantity of nitroglycerin at his disposal, and he employed it usefully. By means of this explosive substance, the rock was broken open at the very places chosen by the engineer. Then, with the pickaxe and spade, the windows and doors were properly shaped. The jagged edges were smoothed off. In a few days after the beginning of the work, Granite House was abundantly lighted by the rising sun, whose rays penetrated into the most secret recesses. Following the plan proposed by Cyrus Harding, the space was to be divided into 5 compartments looking out on the sea. To the right, an entry with a door, which would meet the ladder, then a kitchen 30 feet long, a dining room measuring 40 feet, a sleeping room of equal size, and lastly, a visitor's room, petitioned for by Pencroft, and which was next to the great hall. These rooms, or rather this suite of rooms, would not occupy all the depth of the cave. There would be also a corridor and a storehouse, in which their tools, provisions, and stores would be kept. All the productions of the island, the flora as well as the fauna, were to be there in the best possible state of preservation, and completely sheltered from the damp. There was no want of space, so that each object could be methodically arranged. Besides, the colonists had still at their disposal the little grotto above the great cavern, which was like the garret of their new dwelling. This plan settled, it had only to be put into execution. The miners became brickmakers again, and the bricks were brought to the foot of Granite House. Till then, Harding and his companions had only entered the cavern by the long passage. This mode of communication obliged them to first climb Prospect Heights, making a detour by the river's bank, and then to descend 200 feet through the passage, having to climb as far when they wished to return to the plateau. This was a great loss of time, and it was also very fatiguing. Cyrus Harding, therefore, resolved to proceed without further delay to the fabrication of a strong rope ladder, which, once raised, would render Granite House completely inaccessible. This ladder was manufactured with extreme care, and its uprights, formed of the twisted fibers of a species of cane, had the strength of a thick cable. As to the rounds, they were made of a sort of red cedar, with light, strong branches, and this apparatus was wrought by the masterly hand of Pencroft. Other ropes were made with vegetable fibers, and a sort of crane with a tackle was fixed at the door. In this way, bricks could easily be raised into Granite House. The transport of the materials being thus simplified, the arrangement of the interior could begin immediately. There was no want of lime, and some thousands of bricks were there ready to be used. The framework of the partitions was soon raised, very roughly at first, and in a short time the cave was divided into rooms and storehouses, according to the plan agreed upon. These different works progressed rapidly under the direction of the engineer, who himself handled the hammer and trowel. No labor came amiss to Cyrus Harding, who thus set an example to his intelligent and zealous companions. They worked with confidence, even gaily, Pencroft always having some joke to crack, sometimes carpenter, sometimes ropemaker, sometimes mason, while he communicated his good humor to all the members of their little world. His faith in the engineer was complete. Nothing could disturb it. He believed him capable of undertaking anything, and succeeding in everything. The question of boots and clothes, assuredly a serious question, that of light during the winter months, utilizing the fertile plants of the island, transforming the wild flora into cultivated flora. It all appeared easy to him. Cyrus Harding helping, everything would be done in time. He dreamed of canals facilitating the transport of the riches of the ground, workings of quarries and mines, machines for every industrial manufacture, railroads, yes, railroads, of which a network would certainly one day cover Lincoln Island. The engineer let Pencroft talk. He did not put down the aspirations of this brave heart. He knew how communicable confidence is. He even smiled to hear him speak, and said nothing of the uneasiness for the future which he felt. In fact, in that part of the Pacific, out of the course of vessels, it was to be feared that no help would ever come to them. It was on themselves alone, that the settlers must depend, for the distance of Lincoln Island from all other land was such that to hazard themselves in a boat of a necessarily inferior construction would be a serious and perilous thing. But, as the sailor said, they took quite the wind out of the sails of the Robinsons, for whom everything was done by a miracle. In fact, they were energetic. An energetic man will succeed where an indolent one would vegetate and inevitably perish. Herbert distinguished himself in these works. He was intelligent and active, understanding quickly. He performed well, and Cyrus Harding became more and more attached to the boy. Herbert had a lively and reverent love for the engineer. Pencroft saw the close sympathy which existed between the two, but he was not in the least jealous. Neb was Neb, and he was what he would always be. Courage, zeal, devotion, self-denial personified. He had the same faith in his master that Pencroft had, but he showed it less vehemently. When the sailor was enthusiastic, Neb always looked as if he would say, "Nothing could be more natural." Pencroft and he were great friends. As to Gideon Spilett, he took part in the common work, and was not less skillful in it than his companions, which always rather astounded the sailor. A journalist, clever not only in understanding, but in performing everything. The ladder was finally fixed on the 28th of May. There were not less than 100 rounds in this perpendicular height of 80 feet. Harding had been able, fortunately, to divide it in two parts, profiting by an overhanging of the cliff, which made a projection 40 feet above the ground. This projection, carefully leveled by the pickaxe, made a sort of platform, to which they fixed the first ladder, of which the oscillation was thus diminished one half, and a rope permitted it to be raised to the level of Granite House. As to the second ladder, it was secured both at its lower part, which rested on the projections, and at its upper end, which was fastened to the door. In short, the ascent had been made much easier. Besides, Cyrus Harding hoped later to establish an hydraulic apparatus, which would avoid all fatigue and loss of time for the inhabitants of Granite House. The settlers soon became habituated to the use of this ladder. They were light and active, and Pencroft, as a sailor, accustomed to run up the masts and shrouds, was able to give them lessons. But it was also necessary to give them to Top. The poor dog, with his forepaws, was not formed for this sort of exercise. But Pencroft was such a zealous master that Top ended by properly performing his ascents, and soon mounted the ladder as readily as his brethren in the circus. It need not be said that the sailor was proud of his pupil. However, more than once, Pencroft hoisted him on his back, which Top never complained of. It must be mentioned here that during these works, which were actively conducted, for the bad season was approaching, the alimentary question was not neglected. Every day, the reporter and Herbert, who had been voted purveyors to the colony, devoted some hours to the chase. As yet, they only hunted in Jacamar Wood, on the left of the river, because, for want of a bridge or boat, the Mercy had not yet been crossed. All the immense woods, to which the name of the forests of the far west had been given, were not explored. They reserved this important excursion for the first fine days of the next spring, but Jacamar Woods was full of game. Kangaroos and boars abounded, and the hunters' iron-tipped spears and bows and arrows did wonders. Besides, Herbert discovered towards the southwest point of the lagoon a natural warren, a slightly damp meadow covered with willows and aromatic herbs, which scented the air, such as thyme, basil, savory, all the sweet-scented spices of the labiated plants, which the rabbits appeared to be particularly fond of. On the reporter observing that since the table was spread for the rabbits, it was strange that the rabbits themselves should be wanting, the two sportsmen carefully explored the warren. At any rate, it produced an abundance of useful plants, and a naturalist would have had a good opportunity of studying many specimens of the vegetable kingdom. Herbert gathered several shoots of the basil, rosemary, balm, betony, etc., which possess different medicinal properties, some pectoral, astringent, febrifuge, others antispasmodic or antirheumatic. When afterwards Pencroft asked the use of this collection of herbs, "For medicine," replied the lad, "to treat us when we are ill." "Why should we be ill, since there are no doctors in the island?" asked Pencroft quite seriously. There was no reply to be made to that, but the lad went on with his collection all the same, and it was well received at Granite House. Besides these medicinal herbs, he added a plant known in North America as Oswego tea, which made an excellent beverage. At last, by searching thoroughly, the hunters arrived at the real site of the warren. There the ground was perforated like a sieve. "Here are the burrows," cried Herbert. "Yes," replied the reporter, "so I see." But are they inhabited? That is the question. This was soon answered. Almost immediately, hundreds of little animals, similar to rabbits, fled in every direction, with such rapidity that even Top could not overtake them. Hunters and dog ran in vain. These rodents escaped them easily, but the reporter resolved not to leave the place until he had captured at least half a dozen of the quadrupeds. He wished to stock their larder first, and domesticate those which they might take later. It would not have been difficult to do this with a few stairs stretched at the opening of the burrows, but at this moment they had neither snares nor anything to make them of. They must, therefore, be satisfied with visiting each hole and rummaging in it with a stick, hoping by dint of patience to do what could not be done in any other way. At last, after half an hour, 4 rodents were taken in their holes. They were similar to their European brethren, and are commonly known by the name of American rabbits. This produce of the chase was brought back to Granite House, and figured at the evening repast. The tenants of the warren were not at all to be despised, for they were delicious. It was a valuable resource of the colony, and it appeared to be inexhaustible. On the 31st of May, the partitions were finished. The rooms had now only to be furnished, and this would be work for the long winter days. A chimney was established in the first room, which served as a kitchen. The pipe, destined to conduct the smoke outside, gave some trouble to these amateur bricklayers. It appeared simplest to Harding to make it of brick clay, as creating an outlet for it to the upper plateau was not to be thought of. A hole was pierced in the granite above the window of the kitchen, and the pipe met it like that of an iron stove. Perhaps the wind which blew directly against the facade would make the chimney smoke, but these winds were rare, and besides, Master Neb, the cook, was not so particular about that. When these interior arrangements were finished, the engineer occupied himself in blocking up the outlet by the lake, so as to prevent any access by that way. Masses of rock were rolled to the entrance and strongly cemented together. Cyrus Harding did not yet realize his plan of drowning this opening under the waters of the lake by restoring them to their former level by means of a dam. He contented himself with hiding the obstruction with grass and shrubs, which were planted in the interstices of the rocks, and which next spring would sprout thickly. However, he used the waterfall so as to lead a small stream of fresh water to the new dwelling. A little trench, made below their level, produced this result, and this derivation, from a pure and inexhaustible source, yielded 25 or 30 gallons a day. There would never be any want of water at Granite House. At last, all was finished, and it was time, for the bad season was near. Thick shutters closed the windows of the facade until the engineer had time to make glass. Gideon Spilett had very artistically arranged on the rocky projections around the windows plants of different kinds, as well as long streaming grass, so that the openings were picturesquely framed in green, which had a pleasing effect. The inhabitants of this solid, healthy, and secure dwelling could not but be charmed with their work. The view from the windows extended over a boundless horizon, which was closed by the two Mandible Capes on the north, and Clock Cape on the south. All Union Bay was spread before them. Yes, our brave settlers had reason to be satisfied, and Pencroft was lavish in his praise of what he humorously called his apartments on the 5th floor above the ground. And that brings us to the end of chapter 19. We are at the beginning of the colonists' first winter on the island. They've found a new home. It's quite cozy, but winter in the Pacific is likely to bring some weather. So we'll see what sort of misadventures they'll have in the coming season. But I think for now, that will be where we'll end for the night. We've gotten about another 10% of the way through. We've gotten up to chapter 20, so we're making good progress. And the plot is moving along. The adventures of our 5 castaways and pup are doing their best, and we'll see where their adventures will take them next time. I think our next reading is going to be on Friday evening. So we'll have a couple days to kind of let this stew and settle, and then we'll get back to it. Yep, just waiting for things to really take off. It's been a whole lot of, oh my goodness, the start of this session was a lot of chemistry. So, but all right, I think we will wrap it up here. I have a few things to attend to tonight, and then we'll be calling it a day. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, guys, and I hope to see you join us the next time. Alrighty.